Good morning and welcome to another video. Today I've been asked to do a video about the Z5 latest firmware update 1.4, so we're talking February 2023, and has it improved the autofocus on the Nikon Z5? And I'll cover that shortly. We'll put the camera on the tripod, we'll take some shots, I'll compare it to the Z6 II, and I'll also compare it to the D780, which brings me on to the second part of today's video, which is why this D780 has found its way back into my wedding gear. And if you've seen some of my videos, you might be saying, oh no, not another change. This guy keeps changing his gear from 1 month to the next. Well, I don't really. My mainstay for the last year, for 2022, was the Z5 and the Z6 II. The year before that, it was a D780 and the Z5. I played around with a few other cameras along the way, but basically it's been playing around. The mainstay stays pretty much the same throughout a wedding season. So, second part of the video, I'll be talking about the D780, why it's possibly, maybe, coming back into my wedding gear, and I'll compare it, or at least talk about the D500 and the D850 and why the D780 is the best candidate for me to incorporate back in my wedding gear. Right, let's do the first part first. Let's look at the Z5, the autofocus. So I'll put the Z5 on the tripod, we'll take some shots, I'll do it with the Z6 II and the D780. The Z5 update, which I did probably about 2 weeks ago now, the Z5, the autofocus wasn't as good as the Z6 II. It wasn't a million miles away, but it wasn't as good. And the Z6 II also isn't perfect. Many of you will buy a mirrorless camera, lots of people buy a mirrorless camera because it's got face detect and eye autofocus, so that when they're photographing people or animals or birds or whatever else, you can change it and set it to animal eye autofocus and it will pick up the eyes. For me, wedding photographer, I don't find that very useful, actually, to be honest. Sometimes, yes, sometimes it's an absolute godsend. Most of the time, I just don't find I can rely on it, because even on the Z6 II, someone could be looking at the camera like I am now, and the camera's thinking, yeah, where's the face then? I mean, can it get any more obvious? And it just doesn't pick it up. They turn away, they turn back, and it picks it up. So it's not 100% consistent, and certainly when it then comes to eye autofocus, that's even less consistent. So I actually end up shooting most of my wedding shots on the Z6 II using D9 or wide area, but using the tracking box. I'll talk more about tracking when we come on to talking about the D780 as well. But the tracking box, even on the Z6 II, which should be really useful, because if you're in the wide area mode and it doesn't pick up a face, or it picks up the wrong face and you want to switch it to another face and it hasn't got the little arrow to the left or right, or it doesn't go far enough, then you can just hit a button and get the tracking box up. Put that over the face you want to track, and then you can compose and get the shot and so on and so forth. However, on the Z6 II, and it was even worse on the Z5, that tracking box, if you move the camera around a couple of times to sort of get the right composition, the tracking box many times was no longer over the face. It had gone off and it was focusing on, it looked like it was focusing on a light switch on the wall or something crazy. It wasn't over the face, so it gave you no confidence that when you actually took the shot, you were going to get that face in focus. And certainly if, for anything where the people were moving, like bride walking up the aisle, it should be the perfect way of taking a photo. Put the tracking box over the bride as she's at the end of the aisle, back button focus, continuous focus of course, and as she's walking up, just keep taking shots. Absolutely rubbish, doesn't work. Maybe some of the shots will be in focus, some won't, some will. It's just, again, totally unreliable. That's my experience. So again, I would use D9, move the focus point to the right place and then just track them up the eye with a D9. That does probably over 90% of the shots through focus. So the Z5, as I say, not being even as good as that, could certainly have done with some improvement. So has it improved? Let's put the camera on and we'll take a look. Okay, so here we have the Z5, and if I turn that off and then back on again, you'll see that instantly we have IAF. I can switch to the other eye, focus, no problems whatsoever. If I go down to this one, then I also have perfect focus on both eyes, no problems at all. And if I go up to my lady here, I don't get anything. So this is a situation where IAF and face detect fails. So I would just press my button, which I've set up on the front of the camera, come up with a tracking box, put that over her face, hit back button focus, and we're locked onto her face. And you can see the Z5 is now, with this update, doing a very good job of clinging to her face. Whereas before, by now, that box would have been sort of completely off that photograph. So much improved tracking box performance, and the IAF is, well, we'll see how it compares in a minute to the Z6 II. Let's pop the Z6 II on. We now have the Z6 II on the tripod, and turn it on, and instant IAF, swap to the other eye, focus, back, focus, go down to my other lady, perfect. IAF, swap to the other eye, and back and forth, perfect. As the Z5, exactly the same, will not focus on that face, so bring up the tracking box, over her face, back button focus, and tracking all over the place. Now, this tracking box, let me just explain that this is not 3D tracking. This is tracking, but it's not 3D. On a DSLR, the D780 for instance, which I'll talk about shortly, 3D tracking on that takes into account the depth, the distance from the camera, and it predicts where the subject will be a fraction of a second before you take the photo, so that when you actually take the photo, it should be perfectly in focus. These mirrorless cameras do not have it. The Z9 does, but not the Z6 II. However, maybe now they've done the Z5 update, which has brought the AF pretty much up to the same level as Z6 II, maybe we're going to see an update to the Z6 II's AF to get it halfway between where it is now and maybe the Z9. So I've got some hopes that the Z6 II will get even better than it is now, and will stop me having any grumbles at all about mirrorless AF. Let's now have a look at the D780. Now we're going to look at live view because we can't look through the viewfinder. I just haven't found a way of videoing that successfully, but we'll look at live view so you can compare that to these two guys. Okay, the D780, pop live view on. And the same as the Z6 II, instantly. That's a bit overexposed, isn't it? Let's see if we can. Okay, hopefully that exposure is a bit better. Perfectly picking up her eye and the other eye and that eye, focusing, perfect, and tracking, absolutely no problems whatsoever. Change eyes, tracking, yep, no problems. Down to this one here, same again, no problems. And then up to this one, and we do have a problem. So I need to bring up the tracking box, position, lock, back button focus, and very similar to the two Z cameras. Again, because we're using this focusing system, even though on the OVF we have 3D tracking, this is not 3D tracking. This is the same as the Z cameras. It tracks across the screen, but it won't do depth tracking. Right, let's get back and talk about the D780. So, I hope you found that useful. So basically now, these three cameras, the Z5, the Z6 II and the D780 using live view, pretty much have the same autofocus when it comes to faces and eye autofocus and tracking. As I said, tracking on the Z cameras using the 3D, the tracking box, it's not 3D tracking. Let's now talk about why I have the D780 again. A little bit of history. I went to Sony in 2019, the A7 III, because I thought mirrorless was the future. The Nikon Z6, which had just come out, was rubbish, so I went to Sony. Used that for 2019. 2020, of course, we had COVID. Still did a few weddings, kept the Sony. As I say, didn't do much in the way of weddings or anything, I don't think. Towards the end of 2020, decided that I just couldn't stick with Sony any longer for lots of reasons, which I won't go into now. Didn't like the camera, didn't like the images, didn't like anything about it, so I went back to Nikon. And I got a D780. Because one of the reasons I went to the D780 was I just missed a DSLR. The Sony, let's not talk about whether it took great pictures or anything else, or I didn't like using it. Now, whether that was because it was a Sony or whether it was because mirrorless, at the time, I didn't know. What I did know was I wanted to go back to a proper camera. D780 had only been out a few months, I think, and it looked like a perfect mix between a DSLR and a mirrorless camera, because live view on the back is basically taken straight out the Z6 and gives you the opportunity to have face detect, eye autofocus, focus points right across the screen, everything else, and it works exactly like a Z6, which at the time wasn't very good. But updates have come, and the Z6 AF has also been improved along like with the Z5, and that of course also applies to the D780. So now live view from face and eye autofocus is, as I say, on par with the other two mirrorless cameras. But for me, and this is just for me, okay, I grew up 20 plus years shooting film, and I've tried to work out why it is I prefer a DSLR to a mirrorless. Couple of things. Let me just mention a couple of obvious things. The mirrorless cameras are smaller, and I think, my view, they've gone a little bit too small. These are tools to do a job, and it's rather like making, giving a woodworker a chisel that isn't as long as his hand, so when he's holding it, it's kind of hitting his hand rather than the end of the chisel. They've just gone a bit too far, and that, I think the Z's cameras need to be, you know, that much deeper. Mainly the depth. I'm not worried about the width, the depth, so that you can hold the thing better, you get a better grip on it, give a bit more space for the buttons, because the buttons have also got a little bit on the small side, a little bit crowded together. Without taking your eye, the camera away from your face, it's sometimes difficult to find the right button. DSLRs, a bit bigger, much more suited to this lens, which I'm going to talk about as well in a minute. Buttons down both sides, and it just works. But also, I think one of the more kind of Zen type things is when you shoot film camera, at the very best, when I was shooting film, if I finished a roll of film, I could drive maybe 20-30 minutes to a studio who did film processing. I could get it processed the same day and I could see my pictures. At the very best, we're talking a few hours. So there was this lag between what you saw in the real world and what the photograph looked like. And that kind of built up the anticipation, the expectation, which was sometimes met and sometimes wasn't met. But it just seemed to be part of the photographic process, which, I don't know, I just enjoy that experience. Digital cameras came along, and then it was a matter of shoot, look at the rear screen. Okay, it's gone from being a few hours to a second before you see what you've actually shot. But also, what you see through an optical viewfinder is not the photograph you see on the back of the screen. You can change the picture settings, the colours, you can go to black and white. The lens you've got on through a DSLR, you won't see the depth of field through the viewfinder. So what you see on the back is there's a disconnect between what you see on the viewfinder. And that, for me, is kind of part of the artistic process. And then mirrorless comes along, and you've now got what you see is what you get. There is no difference between what you see in the viewfinder and what the image actually is. And I've lost that. I like, it's probably me being taking photos for the last 35 years, 40 years. But I like that. I find that creative. I can't explain it any more than that. I'm sorry. And that is why I think last year, at the beginning of last year, I sold the D780 and got the Z6 II. So now Z6 II, Z5 for last year. I still missed a DSLR. I had my D700 for taking my own personal shots, but for weddings I still miss that feel, the instant response of a DSLR, because sometimes I miss shots with mirrorless cameras. You pick it up, it's gone to sleep. You press the button, in fact now I even press the button as I'm picking it up, and it still makes you wait, even if it's only half a second. Sometimes that's just enough to miss that particular moment that you wanted to get. So last year, and you've probably seen some videos, I bought, alongside these two to use as well as, I bought a D500 and a D850. So quick, this isn't a camera review, it's just my thoughts. D500, absolutely loved it. It was brilliant. It was about the same size as D780, so a little bit smaller than most Nikon DSLRs. The AF area was right the way across the screen. 151 autofocus points. Brilliant autofocus. 12 frames a second, 14. Very fast burst. Not that I need that for weddings, but it's lovely to have that. And I just loved everything about it. It was absolutely gorgeous. Even the sound of the shutter, I loved that as well. And I even found the perfect lens to go with it for weddings. The Sigma 18-35 1.8 zoom lens, which is full frame equivalent to 24-ish to 50-ish, which is pretty much the range that covers what I use at a wedding. In one lens, on one camera, it was perfect. Apart from noise. It's a crop sensor, and I don't know if that's the reason, but if you got shots at over 1600 ISO, you definitely got some noise there. Which, okay, in Lightroom, couple of clicks, it's a lot better, if not perfect. 2500, you've got to start doing a little bit more work, and you've got to spend more than just a couple of clicks in Lightroom to get what you want. 6000 ISO and up, the image is pretty well falling to pieces. These guys can all shoot at 25,600 ISO, and providing you don't try and push the shadows and lift the exposure too much, the noise is at worst a couple of clicks in Lightroom. They are stunningly good, and the D780, again, not an official review or a comparison, but in my view, the D780 is the best low light camera I've ever used, and I don't think there's many cameras out there by any manufacturer that are going to come any better than the low light performance of the D780 in terms both of the picture quality and the focusing. Shortly after I got the D780, whenever that was, I remember going to a wedding. It was in December. It was in a dark hotel in the middle of Cambridge. It was a 3 o'clock ceremony, so it was almost dark outside anyway. And I got 50% of the shots were at 25,600. There was maybe only half a dozen that I couldn't use. All the rest were quite usable. So that meant the D500, unfortunately, couldn't be used for weddings. So I then went to the D850. Kind of very similar camera in terms of the autofocus area, autofocus, because that was from the D5. So I hoped for great things from the D850. It's quite a bit bigger and heavier than the D500, I found. Back to a normal size sort of DSLR focus area, but with 151 points. And again, would have been a camera that I would have kept and used at weddings. But a couple of problems. It's 45 megapixels. I don't need 1200 shots of a wedding at 45 megapixels. 24 megapixels. I've blown up shots for clients to A1 size. So we're talking, this sort of size from a 24 megapixel camera, and I'd probably done a little bit of cropping on that image anyway. Absolutely perfect. You just don't need 45 megapixels. So on the D850, I would go for the medium raw files, which are around 24, 25 megapixels. But when you do that on the D850, it reduces the shots from 14-bit to 12-bit. And that means a theoretical reduction in image quality. And I've just looked it up on my computer. A 14-bit image gives you 4 trillion colours, 16,384 shades per channel. So giving you 4 trillion colours. 12-bit reduces that to 68 billion. Okay, it's still an awful lot, a heck of a lot, and it probably in reality doesn't actually affect the image quality, but it just felt weird having this super duper camera which in theory didn't give such good images as the Z5 in theory. Anyway, so that was one thing. And the other thing is the cameras that I've got, the Z5, the Z6 II and the D780, the top dial is the mode dial. And on the mode dial you'll find U1, U2 and U3, only U1 and U2 on the D780. I use those extensively because you can set the camera up to be a totally different camera. And my Z6 the Z6 and Z5 are set up basically as 5 different cameras. I've got U1 is completely manual, black and white, manual focus, manual exposure, buttons set up differently so that I can zoom in with just the press of a button to do manual focus, all sorts of things. U2 is for flash photography, off-camera flash, go to that, it's manual exposure, the flash is set up correctly and all this kind of thing. U3 is set up for fast action shooting, and then I've got manual and aperture priority as well. So 5 different cameras. The D850 has got this ridiculous, crazy menu bank system that Nikon put on their Pro cameras, where you go into the menu bank, you set the camera up, and you can choose which menu bank you want to use to take this shot. Do that, and while you're doing that, you change the shutter speed. Then you go back to something else. Next time you go to use that menu bank, the bloody shutter speed is the one you just used, not the one you originally set it up as. It's absolutely bonkers. So I hate it. And there's another reason why I didn't like the D850. So I've ended up with a D780, which is my most favourite DSLR ever. And the reason I particularly want that is because I found a new lens. I say new, I've been using it for a few months now, probably 6 or 8 weddings, and it's the Sigma 40mm art lens. I didn't actually know about this until about 6 months ago. I read reviews, watched videos, and was astounded by the image quality and what people were saying about it. It's been out for a couple of years. But for me, 40mm is actually the Goldilocks focal length. I find 35 a little tiny bit short. I find 50 sometimes a little bit long. So for last year, I was shooting with the Z5 with a 24mm lens on, and the Z6 II with a 58 1.4 lens on, and I would swap from one to the other. But with a 40mm lens, I could shoot, and I will be shooting, weddings pretty much exclusively with a 40mm lens. And the problem on the Z6 II is it is enormous compared to the camera size, because you've got the lens, the adapter, and then quite a small camera, and it just feels overwhelmed by that lens. As I say, I've done about 6 weddings with it, and it works absolutely brilliantly. The images, I'm not doing a lens review of that lens, but go online, check out the Sigma 40mm 1.4 art lens, and it is head and shoulders above even Sigma's other art lenses. It's astounding. If I take this lens and pop it onto a D780, a DSLR, obviously I don't need the adapter, it's quite a bit shorter, the camera is bigger, and it just feels right. It feels much more comfortable. Happy to use that all day long. So I'm going to leave you with a few photos taken with the Z6 II with the Sigma 40mm lens on. I haven't yet got any wedding shots with the 780 with the 40mm lens on, but I expect them to be every bit as good. I hope that's been worth watching, and I wish you a very good day and enjoy your photography. Thanks for watching. Cheers.